Good morning or good evening, everyone, especially if you're in Australia. This is Piero San Giorgio, author of Survive the Economic Collapse and many other great books, which you must read. And today I have the immense pleasure to greet Daniela Sulikowski. I pronounce it right, I know. I'm familiar with that part of the world where you come from. And I'm very, very happy and pleased as you are. You have a lot of credentials and a lot of knowledge about the topic that is dear to me for one of my next books. So you're probably going to see this way before the book comes out. And you, Professor Dani Sulikowski, you are professor at Charles Sturt University in Australia, and you publish and you're on the editorial boards of Personality and Individual Differences, Frontiers in Psychology, and Scientific Reports. So I presume you are both a psychology professor and anyways, a specialist in evolutional psychology, which is a field that is very dear and important to me and my research. So Dani, welcome to my little YouTube channel, and it will be great to have you in my next book about these important topics.
Oh, delighted to be here.
So my first question is going to be provoking. Why are women collapsing civilizations?
Why are women? Okay, let's start with the short answer. So the short answer is that I think women are collapsing civilization because the genetic reward for doing so is potentially immense. That's the short answer. We might need a little bit more detail.
Yes, what does it mean? What do you mean by genetic rewards? I think I know, but my audience might not. What do you mean by genetic reward?
Okay, so the theory that I've been thinking about lately and that I've been talking about a little bit, the we may talk a little bit more about what leads up to this, but the end point of declining birth rates will be a shrinking population and some sort of a population bottleneck, which means that the population gets, or the reproductive capacity of the population at least gets quite small, which means that if after the bottleneck it then expands out quite rapidly, that small number of people who were then survived to be in the bottleneck then get tremendous overrepresentation in the population as it expands compared to what they might have had before bringing on a bottleneck. So if you can behave in such a way that brings on a bottleneck such that you are one of the few lineages to survive that bottleneck, then you may go from having a relatively modest representation. Your lineage may have a very modest representation in the whole population prior to that. Afterwards, you could have huge representation. And so any system that can select for that to happen is potentially going to be very adaptive.
So if I have four kids, which is not a lot compared to what my grandparents used to have, or my great grandparents in Italy or elsewhere, or today's in Africa or so on, it's not a lot. However, compared to the average couple here in Switzerland or Europe in general, where people both parents work and they're quite happy with 1.2 children, obviously that's four times as many. And so my genetics are an advantage, and my wife genetics as well. That's
Yes,
what you
that's right.
mean.
That's pretty much it. So the key thing to remember about reproductive success is that the metric that matters is not absolute reproductive success, it's relative reproductive success, and it's relative to the background population rate of reproductive success. So yeah, if you've got four kids in a population where the average is 1.2, then you're doing very, very well. And if that were to continue generation after generation, your lineages would become increasingly represented. If you were in the same, or rather, if you were in the same situation, having the same number of children in a population where the average man was having 6 children, then over generations you'll become less and less represented. So the metric that counts is relative reproductive success. So as women engaging in manipulative reproductive suppression, which is what I'm arguing is one of the primary drivers, if not the primary driver, of birth rate decline, if you can engage in behaviors which may have a result of lowering your own birth rate, but lowering the background population birth rate even more, then that will be an adaptive strategy. So we're seeing birth rates decline overall, but the individual women who are still breeding relatively more will be the ones who are left at the inevitable bottleneck, assuming that there is a re-expansion of the population at some point.
So today, there's two elements that I'd like you to comment on. Today, the population, the populations that have the highest reproductive rate are religious fundamentalists of
Yes.
all creeds, in fact, and Africans. I've worked in Africa, and I could definitely see the birth rate not dropping significantly, a bit, but not overall over the last 40 years. The other element that is interesting to comment perhaps for you on is that now, what drives down, and perhaps this is a question, in fact, what drives down birth rate seems to be a lot empowering of women, joining the workplace, rights of women, feminism. But this is done by women who, at least as far as I know, and perhaps you can correct if that's not a good affirmation, seem to be women who don't make a lot of kids generally, because they are not religious fundamentalists nor Africans. If I'm a bit
Yeah.
stereotyping a bit, but is that process a bit conscious or unconscious, or is it, or are
So
these feminists a tool of people who really want to push this agenda?
So this is sort of gets to the crux of the evolutionary paradox. So if we sort of step back for a minute and just consider what feminism is. So feminism in the current world, if you like, you know, you there's various waves of feminism. Did it begin with the suffragettes? Did it begin in the 60s with the sexual revolution? It doesn't really much matter, but what we see as a result of feminism, and what I argue is the sort of fundamental function that feminism serves, is an increase in women's representation in civic duties and in the workplace. So effectively, the investment of a lot of female time and resources away from the family home and away from child rearing. And one of the reasons why I think that that is one of the sort of underlying primary functions of feminism is because we see a similar thing going back through past civilizations. So one of the markers of past civilizations, as far as I can tell, and I'm far from an expert, but I'm very quickly trying to become one, but an increase in the female participation in civic duties in the workforce appears to be a reliable feature of civilizations as they become more mature and then eventually decline. And it's almost an unavoidable outcome that if the women of a population are spending their time doing something other than rearing children, then the birth rate of the population has to decline. It's an unavoidable consequence, because women are by virtue of the way biological reproduction works, women are the rate limiters of a population's capacity to reproduce, right? You can have a very small number of men, you can send many of those men away to war, and in fact, civilizations and societies, nation states, whatever you want to call them, frequently did and do. And your population can recover within a generation, provided you have not lost very many women in that war, right? The small number of remaining men can do what needs to be done to produce the next generation. If it were the reverse and you lost a large proportion of women, then the reproductive capacity of the population just takes a massive hit. So if you then have a situation where large numbers of women are investing large amounts of time and resource, it has in something other than rearing children, it has the same impact as if you were to send those women off to war on the population's capacity to reproduce. So the birth rate is going to have to go down. It has to go down. It can't not, when you start seeing women investing in other activities. And so it's a very reliable way to begin to ratchet down your population's birth rate, to start to jump on the back of what we currently call feminist ideas that suggest that women should get out of the home and into civic life, into the workplace, into businesses, into whatever it might be. It would be a reliable strategy, you know, across civilizations, across timescales, to begin to ratchet down a birth rate. The other way to look at it is that you also have a situation in that's repeated across civilizations as well, where you can sort of see the cause and effect possibly happening in somewhat the opposite direction, where when a civilization gets strong and gets wealthy and has a certain level of comfort, then you start to see mortality rates, including mortality rates of babies, going down if there's nutrition reliably available and good sanitation and whatever. And so the other sort of change that will happen then in a civilization when you start to see that is that women will begin to have fewer children, not for any kind of reproductive suppression reasons, but just because the optimal number of children for any woman to have, if the child mortality rate is going to go down, then the optimal number of children that you have is going to go down. So what matters again is not just how many children you have, but the survival of those children and the quality of those children and how well those children go on to reproduce. So it's not a matter necessarily of more is better. There is an optimum number as a function of what is the odds of each child's survival, what resources do you have to rear those children up to be of a certain strength and of a certain wealth and of a certain social status, if you would like them to successfully go on and carry your lineage. And so if a decrease in child mortality means that women will then down-regulate the number of children that they have as a result, well, just like everything else in a society that builds wealth, things become more efficient, and so raising children becomes more efficient, which means that women then have time free to engage in other activities. And so then the question becomes, well, what is it most adaptive for women to do? What should they be spending their time engaging in if they have this time available that no longer has to be spent on child rearing? If the optimal solution to the reproductive balance is that it doesn't use up all of their time, then what is it that they should best be doing? And in terms of sort of the evolutionary the evolutionary selection pressures, if you can't have any more children yourself because you're having the optimal number of children for the resources and standing and position that you hold, then the next best thing that you can do to increase your relative reproductive success is to stop other people having children. So once you've invested in as many as you can have yourself, the next best thing you would be expected to go out to do is to stop other women having children. And as previously discussed, one of the best ways to do that is to begin encouraging women to invest in other parts of society other than raising children and having families. And so you start convincing women to get involved in civic society, having jobs, having businesses, and then we, can sort of fast forward to now, where we see not just women doing those things because they have additional time left after having children, we see women prioritizing those types of activities over having children, so much so that many women have children a lot later than they would ideally like, and many women leaving it too late and having no children at all. So it becomes, however it arises, it becomes a very effective strategy for reproductive inhibition of other women to be promoting the types of feminist ideas that we see.
How much this process is, in your opinion, conscious or unconscious?
It's a good question. It's probably one of the questions that I get asked the most, and it's probably one that I like the least. So I'm going to have to start thinking of a better answer to it. So the short answer for me is that it doesn't really matter.
Mm-hmm.
But that's probably not
Good
the
answer.
answer that most people want.
No, but it's a good answer. It's a good answer.
It matters to other people, right? So, in terms of, so I had maybe this can sort of illustrate it quite simply. I had a really brief exchange with someone on Twitter, and they were asking about why do women talk about sex more often than men talk about sex. And I went through a little explanation for why that might be, what the adaptive function of women effectively sharing details of their sexual liaisons with each other might be, and therefore why they might do it. And the reply came back, but isn't it also just the case that women enjoy it more? Like enjoy talking about sex more, I mean.
Ah,
Isn't it just the case that women enjoy talking about sex more than men do? And the answer to that is yes, they do, but that's not an alternative explanation. If evolution is going to select for women to talk about sex more, there needs to be some proximal mechanism being selected for that will make women talk about sex. So it would be quite difficult to imagine a sort of proximate psychological mechanism that would motivate women to do something they don't enjoy doing. So of course, if you want women to talk about sex more than men, evolutionarily speaking, then a great way to achieve that is to have women evolve mechanisms that mean they find it intrinsically rewarding to talk about sex. So
or or it's a byproduct of another behavior. I
or
mean,
it's a
a
byproduct of another behavior. That's right. But even if it's a byproduct of another behavior, it still means that there is something that is being selected for there.
okay.
So that the fact that you're getting proximal enjoyment of a behavior does not rule out the fact that that behavior serves some sort of a functional purpose. And it's the same thing with conscious awareness. What women believe their motives are for various behaviors will be largely orthogonal to the evolutionary function those behaviors serve. So that when evolution selects for particular mechanisms, what you get is a mechanism that produces a behavior that has outcomes in terms of fitness, in terms of net relative reproductive success. And if those are positive outcomes, then the mechanisms that led to those behavior, they will be selected for, and they will increase in frequency and eventually become shaped to be more and more adaptive. So there's no need for women to have any understanding of what the consequences of their behavior might be. And of course, I mean, one of the sort of very fundamental learnings of psychology is that people generally aren't good at telling you why they do stuff, right? That's not something that people typically are very good at. We don't have good insight into our own behavior. We don't have good insight into our own motives. But what we do have is tremendous ability to rationalize our behavior. So people can behave in quite irrational ways and be largely untroubled by that, and will accept relatively, really quite illogical and fairly weak rationalizations, but nevertheless be quite satisfied with those and go on behaving in certain ways. So I don't think that there is necessarily much conscious awareness of what's going on. Doesn't need to be any conscious awareness, and whatever the mechanisms are that have been selected for to produce this behavior aren't sort of a challenge to the functions of that behavior. If the behavior produces certain functions, those functions will produce the selection pressures on the mechanisms, whatever those mechanisms are. So it's a little step in the process, but it's sort of it's not, knowing what the mechanism is doesn't change the function. Knowing what the function is doesn't tell you necessarily that much about the mechanism. So they're largely orthogonal questions to be answering about whether people are conscious or not. I guess one last thing that it's probably worth observing is that intersexual competition generally can get very nasty. So certain aspects of intersexual competition are very nasty, and they do appear to be, the tendency to behave in that way does appear to be reasonably strongly correlated with nasty personality traits like psychopathy, narcissism, Machiavellianism, and sadism. So I suspect that there are certainly aspects of intersexual competition that people engage in, if not, fully cognizant of the reproductive consequences of the behavior, certainly cognizant of the fact that it's nasty and are entirely comfortable with that, and that you could say is to some extent conscious. But I don't think that we need to appeal to those kinds of motives on the whole to explain sort of population-wide reproductive suppression. And I think if you did try to appeal to those motives on the whole, you would probably end up in trouble. I think any behavior that was sort of positive is going to spread throughout the population and become something of a norm. It's not going to successfully do that if it's leveraging off antisocial motives, because people are generally really quite pro-social and quite cooperative. So mechanisms that leverage off those are much more likely to be able to become widespread throughout a population and adopt social norms, become adopted as social norms.
Now, I've studied a bit of history, especially of empires and civilizations that collapse, and certainly it is true that the let's say the elites, the upper classes of societies of empires, for example, tend to have fewer children, and in fact, in the cases, for example, of the Roman Empire, first century, starting in first century already, there is a tendency to actually not have any children at all for the women of the upper crust, of the upper classes. In fact, they would do abortion quite a lot,
Yeah.
and fathers would adopt heirs and not have biological children. Uh, And with some exceptions in today's, for example, in the last 30 years in Saudi Arabia, which was a very wealthy country and where the more you were wealthy, the more you would have women, the more you would have children. And with some exceptions, one king in Morocco, a few, Genghis Khan is the famous poster child of having lots of children. But with exceptions, the vast majority of upper classes, including royalty across the world, has very, very little children over history. And however, it seems that the only time we have the masses who decrease voluntarily, in a way, as you described, it could be unconscious, population is our current Western society, and not necessarily everywhere. Although you do see a drop in natality, in birth rate, even in North Africa, which used to be higher. Now it's the same very low level as in Europe. It's less than two. Even in the Middle East, with some exceptions, again, the religious fundamentalists in Israel, in Muslim countries, but in many countries, it's decreasing. It's not under two, but it's decreasing fast. Um, Turkey is under two. Egypt is still above two, but but in the West, for sure, it's decreasing extremely fast. And Japan could be
Yeah.
counted as
Japan,
West in
Korea.
that. Australia, I believe, is also a bit getting there.
Yeah.
So let me ask the conspiracy question is
Yeah.
is there a power that pushes for this, and it's linked to your unconscious approach, but is there a conscious approach? Because it seems to me that especially as I wrote this book, which is available in English, about women feminism and its development. For sure, feminism is not a byproduct of chance and out of nowhere. It was planned, organized, delivered, and successfully so. How much the low birth rate is also in that kind of plan, in your opinion?
Look, I think it's tricky to sort of label these things as strategic, because I guess one way to think about it is that if ostensibly I'm correct, and a big part of what I'm proposing is that once societies reach a certain level of wealth, that you get reliably a bunch of changes that happen, and one of those is then the declining birth rates, and a whole bunch of other things go along with that. And my theory is effectively that this is not just a series of happenstance, that this is effectively a system that has been evolved to function in this way, a such that it produces a genetic bottleneck at some point. And that is ultimately where the selection pressure comes from to, select for this system and make it happen. Whenever you have anything like that sort of an evolved complex system, it's going to look like it's been designed, right? It's going to look like someone has designed it. And when individuals behave in particular ways that appear to facilitate those outcomes, it's going to look like there is coordination across, and some sort of guiding hand. But what there actually just is a whole bunch of individuals responding in particular ways to the circumstances and the cues that they pick up on the environment. that are, that result in particular behavior, and the overall coordination of those individuals behaving in that way produces the kinds of outcomes that we see. And so rather than it necessarily being the case that there is some overarching conspiracy or guiding hand, I think it's much more likely to look at it in the case that it is inevitable that certain ideas will get presented, and then it is inevitable that those ideas will be appealing to particular people who will then run with them. And given that, it's then inevitable what the responses to that will be. And so we see what looks like this sort of well orchestrated plan that, might sort of unroll over decades and look for all the world like it must be some sort of major, cross-government conspiracy rolling out the same way across all these countries. But I think it's much better accounted for just by presuming that, well, maybe not better accounted for by presuming, let me rephrase that. If we presume that there is this evolved system that functions in this way, that accounts for what would very much look like a large scale conspiracy in which all these different groups have their different vested interests and all play their role. It looks like a coordinated rolling out of a plan, when in fact it's just the way human societies cycle.
I humbly agree with that, in the sense that a lot of historical events look like conspiracies in hindsight. It doesn't mean that conspiracy doesn't exist. They do
That's
exist.
right.
However, they usually don't last long, because, as we know, the plans don't last long in face of battle. So think of Gallipoli for Australia. It usually fails. However, do you see patterns in history? Because you come from the psychology and evolutionary psychology world, which I respect a lot, and it's very interesting. However, it always has to be challenged with reality. Do you see patterns? Because in today's society, clearly that's the trend we're in. Do you see patterns in other histories or empires or civilizations that you've studied so far?
So I wouldn't go so far as to say I've studied past civilizations. So what I have done fairly recently is probably best described as confirmation bias so far. So for the moment, the first thing that I'm trying to do as someone who has not spent most of their career being especially interested in ancient civilizations, or indeed other modern civilizations for the most part. So, my background is sort of in animal behavior, and from there, human behavior, and from their evolutionary psychology and these other things. So I don't have I have a 20-year career in psychology and behavior. I certainly don't have a 20-year career in the history of civilizations. So what I've done so far is effectively attempt to look for at least proof of principle. So, can we at least find what looks like these types of things unfolding in other civilizations? And to that, the answer is more or less yes. But the concerns and it's things like, so one thing that kind of jumped out at me when I saw it, because it just seemed so anachronistic, and I guess that probably speaks as much to my lack of familiarity with past civilizations, I guess, that maybe I thought that. But I think in sort of around the 10th century, in sort of the Arabic, empire, they introduced a 5-day working week in response to the economy beginning to sort of crumble and productivity falling. They did what, the geniuses in Australia are arguing for right now. We already have a 5-day working week. We're arguing for a 4-day one, because I'm sure that will
Right,
solve
try one like in France.
Anyway, but that kind of stuck with me, because I just thought something about that, because one of the sort of things I'm, again, not an economist, but one of the other things I'm getting really interested in is how the economic responses to the consequences of a declining birth rate, and it's not just a declining birth rate, there's a whole host of things that go along with this sort of, well, let's just say feminism, manipulative reproductive suppression. There's a whole lot of host of things that go along with it that seem to have parallels in Rome and in the Arabic Empire, at least, if not elsewhere. And those things are also not just the increase of women in the institutions, but the decline in the meritocracy, the
Hmm.
the massive um, I think that someone terms it the overproduction of the elites, but I don't think it's an overproduction of elites necessarily. I think it's actually because the meritocracy crumbles and flattens, it just gives a greater volume of people access to what were previously considered elite professions, or professions that you needed to have substantial merit to access. And what happens is when you invert that, and you not just you not just allow people who are not exceptional to have access to those professions, you actually preference people who are not exceptional to have access to those professions, which I think is what we're currently seeing in the academy,
Yes.
which is why the academy is in such trouble. It's not just that it's a lot easier to get a PhD and call yourself doctor or
Yeah.
professor than it used to be. It's actually easier to do that if you're not as talented, if you're not as educated, as knowledgeable, as critical. It's actually easier. So it's not just sort of a flattening of the meritocracy. There's an inversion of the meritocracy, and that appears to be sort of a recurring theme as well, that all of a sudden every second person has a book to write. So when Rome's falling, everybody's busy writing a book all of a sudden, and everybody thinks they're an intellectual and wants to participate in intellectual life. And I don't think that the inversion of the meritocracy is an accident either. I think that is also almost a unavoidable consequence of having increased female representation in all of these institutions, is that it does invert the meritocracy. And therefore that then has quite predictable and foreseeable consequences for government, for economic decisions. So instead of having governments, countries, nation states, responding in sensible ways to the economic challenges they face, you have them in ways that again look for all the world like they're trying to bring their own society down. So, they have problems with productivity, they're having problems with revenue, and they decide to do things that will exacerbate those problems, not alleviate them. And I think that is also a part of it as well. But the sort of overarching concern that I still have about all of this is sort of, I've been reassured by people who know much more about these civilizations than I do, because that's one of the quickest ways to learn stuff, is to actually just talk to people who know more than you do, much quicker than reading. But the fear I've got is that civilizations crumbling are going to have things in common just because they're civilizations that are crumbling or in decline or falling, completely irrespective of the reasons why they're in decline. And so until I have a much better understanding of sort of, I think that's probably the best way to do it, is probably with case studies, to sort of pick individual civilizations which are still recent enough that we have good, reliable information about what was going on, and then see if we can actually retrofit these explanations to those in falsifiable ways that fit, not
Yeah.
just sort of, because it is easy to pick out all these things that they have in common, but you've got to look for what do they not have in common, and do any of those things matter in the grand scheme of things. So that's where I'm at the moment. I can sort of point out a few things that I find fascinating and that are very tempting to get caught up in, but until I have enough knowledge myself that I'm confident to
Hmm.
say yes. At the moment, I don't think I am yet.
Yeah, I guess it is one of the difficulties in this field of psychology and evolutionary psychology. Is, first of all, we were not there before, and it's very hard to get historical statistics because we roughly know censuses, for example, for empires, so we can guess the birth rate based on regression in mathematics. But it's and of course we know the accurate, fairly accurate number of kids that the very high rulers had and how many wives and so on. But in the middle, it's difficult to know for sure. And also another issue is that clearly we have to do generalizations, and it's like saying, on average, women are shorter than men by ethnicity, within an ethnicity, of course. And then you always have someone who says, "Oh, but that's not true because I know a woman who's taller than her husband." and so you face the difficulty of people even understanding things like averages or generalities. However, there is a point saying that generalities don't make a rule, don't make a scientific study. So what are the methods that you use to prove that, or to, is there some, of course we're not going to do experiments on mice because they're not human, but is there environments that we can study this, or because what you said just before is interesting. I'll give you two examples, two countries that I'm studying. One is China, immensely growing, powerfully
Yeah.
growing. It's not an empire, but it's a very powerful economic country, and yet it has a declining birth rate very fast as well. So
Yeah.
maybe they're a bit later in the evolution curve, and therefore they will have problem 50 years from now or 30 years from now. Another example is Russia. Russia is extremely growing in terms of economy, and yet it's trying to reverse the dropping birth rate. It seems to be flattening, but it's still lower. It's still lower than 2. It's 1.7, I think, or something like that. But it used to be going pretty fast, and now it's been almost a decade that is flat.
Mm.
I could ask my fiancée who's here what she thinks about Russian and women, but it also keeps a traditional spirit,
Yes.
whatever that means.
Yeah.
Certainly in West, there are pockets of that, again, religious fundamentalists, but not only. I don't want to be a caricature of that. I don't want to
Yeah.
mean to do a caricature, but so I'm sorry I went on a tangent, but what are the methods that you could use to study? So maybe you need more funding. Maybe we can ask for funding, please.
You can
If you listen
ask for
to us,
funding.
send money to Professor. And what would be the strategy, or the methods rather, to get this precise?
So I think there's probably three kind of points of attack in that regard. So the first one, I think, actually, and I almost, as a quantitative psychologist, I can't believe I'm about to say the dirty word. I think qualitative research is actually going to be incredibly important, because one thing that I'm sort of I can't think of the word, warming to, I guess maybe is not the phrase, but it's a bit like it. One thing I'm beginning to realize, I think, is that there's tremendous knowledge in the daily artifacts of a civilization. So, you know, as unhealthy as it is, I'm quite sure, to spend the amount of time on social media that I do spend, it's becoming an increasingly more fascinating experience, that the more I begin to think about what I'm seeing and what I'm watching. And obviously, look, we live, I mean, every empire, society that has ever existed has existed in a time that was unique. That they have mostly existed at points in time where the technology that they have is the most advanced it's ever been, at least maybe in their living memory. I know that we've lost technology with civilizations, but then the next one's come along. But obviously, the world that we live in now, and the ability to record information for subsequent generations, or to look back and study and whatever, obviously that's unparalleled. But what I'm becoming more and more interested in is what were the equivalents of these kinds of daily artifacts in previous civilizations. What were people talking about? What was in the newspapers? What was the conversations that people were having in the pubs, in the bars, around the dinner tables? Because I think certainly so much of what I'm beginning to look at as trying to sort of nut out what might be, if I'm correct about this idea of widespread manipulative reproductive suppression, then what are the actual mechanisms of it? What is it that women are doing and saying on a daily basis that is having these impacts on the decision making of other women? That's what I'm really interested in. And so if I can figure that out, and then I can look at whether or not we can see evidence of those types of things in time gone by. So a little bit of a parallel example, which is not quite reproductive suppression, but it might kind of give you an idea what I'm talking about. On sort of Instagram, or I'm not on Instagram, but on Instagram, you have a lot of influencers, right? So you've got a lot of these women who live the, also portray these perfect lives, right? So they have these ridiculously tidy homes, and all they do is sit around all day. I don't know. You can tell that I'm not on Instagram, but I'm very quickly running out of things to describe what influencers actually do. But right, but they portray these perfect lives, right? Perfect kids, perfect husbands, perfect lives, beautiful houses, everything's wonderful. And few adults, few, fully functioning adults, I think, really buy that act. We get that it's an act, right? We get, right? But a lot of young, impressionable women don't think that's an act, right? They actually think that that's a life that they are aspiring to. And so we've got that as sort of like one little cultural artifact, little cultural phenomenon that's happening. If we just go back to the, I don't know, 50s, say, and you would get these books on how to be a perfect wife, have dinner cooked for your husband when he gets home, always be in a good mood, do every, all, yeah, blah, 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 right? All these things. And feminists love telling us how sexist and oppressive those books were, and horrible, 50s was a terrible time for women, blah blah blah. But of course, men weren't authoring those books. Women were authoring those books, and they were selling them to other
Hmm.
women.
Sure.
And I think that those books are the exact equivalent of what the Instagram influencers are now. They were ways of manipulating and putting pressure on other women to say, this is how you have to be a perfect wife, and setting up an impossible to reach ideal that other women would, invest valuable time and effort and energy in trying to live up to. And of course, it was completely unrealistic. They weren't actually the societal standards any more than the ridiculous influencer is the societal standards now. It's just one of feminism's little sleight of hands to convince people that that was actually what was expected of women, and it wasn't. It never was. And so being able to draw the parallels between like the 1950s, female etiquette books and the 2020 influencers, well, I want to try and draw, exactly those kinds of parallels, but not going back to 1950, going back to 1550. I want to see, can we find examples of this female, manipulative behavior, so female driven behavior designed to manipulate other women, to misdirect their mating efforts, to obscure their mating decisions, to undermine their reproductive efforts. Can we find evidence of that going back? So that's what I sort of mean by qualitatively investigating histories. I think that so that's one prong, and then I think the second prong is what you were mentioning, which is looking at the hard data. So looking at the birth rates and the economies and the other societal indicators, and when wars happened, and population sizes and migration and all of these types of things, and trying to sort of predict. And I know that a lot of work has kind of been done in that realm already to some extent, but that's kind of one. And then that would sort of then be prong number two, that kind of large scale statistical sort of work. And then I think prong number three is the other sort of work that I was doing and still am doing that kind of started all this off, and that is just looking at female psychology now and trying to understand, what are women doing on a day-to-day basis aside from being Instagram influencers? What else are they doing that is actually, can we actually identify the particular type of women who are promoting these types of behaviors but not necessarily engaging in them themselves? Because that has to be the kind of paradox resolution to this whole theory. If women are just driving everybody's birth rates down, and those women who are most emphatic and enthusiastic about these ideologies that do that are the ones who have the least children and have zero lineage representation at the end, then the behavioral mechanisms that drive these ideologies do not get selected for. The only way they get selected for is if there are women who are driving them influentially and strongly, who have representation at the end. So we have to identify, like, it's easy to identify the feminists who aren't having children. That's That's the majority of them, right? That's easy. The difficulty is trying to identify who's engaging in the types of behaviors that motivate this ideology, but is nevertheless
Yeah.
having children. And if we can identify that group, and there actually are things that those women have in common, they actually are an identifiable group, not just, various, sort of an incoherent collection of people that you can find in surveys who tell you that they've got 5 kids but are a radical feminist or something. If there is something that coherently holds them together, then we can start thinking about how this kind of stuff gets off the ground and who is
Mhm.
actually pushing it and who in society is effectively a follower and who is a leader. So who's winning. This is a game of manipulative reproductive suppression where the entire population's birth rate shrinks and keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller, is a game that inevitably the majority of people lose and a minority of people win. So it's not in most people's interest to even be playing this game, except that what we're seeing is that the vast majority of women are playing this game to some extent. They're either playing it genuinely or they're at least sending out the signals of playing the game, even if they don't actually endorse that ideology. So something must be sort of, there's either a social policing or some sort of social, forces that compel women to play this game. And certainly that's a pretty compelling
Mm.
explanation for it, because women are very prone to social contagions, very
Yes,
sensitive to ostracism.
more than
So
men.
certainly much more than men, very sensitive to ostracism, and so and very motivated to avoid ostracism. And so certainly a level of just social coercion, if you like, on behalf of other women forces everyone to play this game, which the vast majority will lose. The question is who wins. That we have to identify who is winning, and can we link them to being the people who are driving these behaviors in the first place.
Yeah.
Because if we can't do that, then the system can't work the way I'm proposing. So that's kind of the other prong of it. Can we actually identify the people, the individuals who we are hypothesizing are going to be the ones left at the end?
So two authors that I was, of course, reading many years ago and I was rereading again. One is David M. Buss, who wrote a lot about the psychology and the behavior of men and women. He's been around for decades. And
Forever.
another one
I've
is
embarrassed myself in front of him several times. I'm
I
sure he
can
thinks I'm
imagine.
absolutely bonkers. I've met
And
him. I've met him 2 or 3 times and made an absolute tit of myself every time. Anyway,
oh
keep
well,
going.
he's done a lot of studies, but of course, in this field, as we said before, generalizations are difficult to do because we have so many oddities in human behavior. Um, and he was, for example, and I'll ask you the question first, and then I'll talk about the second author is Gad Saad from
Oh
Canada,
yes.
which I appreciate a lot. I cannot vouch for the validity of his reasoning and work, but theories are interesting.
Mm.
Certainly, if David Buss says that there is when there's more men in a society than women can choose what they think, and obviously because there are a lot of single mothers, that choice is not always rational or successful, but
Yep.
certainly they can think they can choose. There's a tendency to choose the best mate based on more choice. If there are less men, it's difficult to choose. You have to compete, and usually you have more. Or his theory is that when you have less men than women, you have much more promiscuity, and the woman would give access to their reproduction, whether you have contraception or not. Your
Yep.
brain still thinks it's reproductive,
Yep.
easier than when you have choice, and therefore. Um, one of the ideas was that why women vote, for example, for more immigration and more male immigration in reality, because usually it's males, is to have more competition between males. But what is odd is why would they at the same time push for a lower status and a lower I can summarize testosterone level, but certainly a lower assertion of the local population. Is it like a test to see who's fit enough to keep strong and don't care about the fact that you need to be, I will joke, a soya boy? This is not from my generation, of course, but
Yeah.
that's what young people say these days when they make fun of someone who's a bit weak and feminine. They say, "Oh, you're a soya boy." I like soya, but anyway, I don't have this problem. Not my generation, but in the younger generation, it seems to be the case that uh, Western males are pushed down with the feminism and the woke ideology and all that, and yet you bring and yet women in general vote and support policies that bring in much more males. And I think Gadsad's theory is that this create much more um, competition. Do you think that that's a theory that holds, or not?
Not, not quite. I mean, it's not so much so as whether or not I think it's a theory that holds, because I think, so we've sort of got the theory that I'm sort of a proponent of, if you like, what I've kind of come up with, and it's not quite exactly as Gadsad says. Um, so certainly David Buss is right about the sex ratio. So generally speaking, whichever sex you have fewer of is the sex that gets to set the rules. And so when you have an over sort of predominance of women, then men get to set the rules. The women have to compete more heavily, and when women sort of compete more heavily, you see things like the price of sex coming down, so women being more likely to and more available to have casual sex and things like that. And then in the reverse, you see those opposite patterns. So that, and that's pretty like that's pretty standard fare now. That's pretty well accepted and very true. In terms of women supporting immigration and the native population sort of being seen as weak and everything like that, I think so. We sort of put immigration to the side for a minute. I'll get to that in a moment. But first of all, just looking at feminism's attacks on masculinity. So my take on that is that, so one step further back, it's really important to understand with intersexual competition that until we reach a point of sort of mass population level reproductive inhibition where you're bringing birth rates down, in which case stopping kind of anyone potentially from breeding can assist with that, although as previously explained, more so women. When you're just talking about sort of basic individual level intersexual competition, because every child is born of a man and a woman, the men in the population get 50% of the reproductive success and the women get 50% of the reproductive success. As a woman, I can't steal any of your reproductive success. I can steal the reproductive success of other women. So by getting a greater share, you know, a disproportionately large share of the reproductive success, which will by necessity steal it from other women, and you can get a disproportionate share of male reproductive success, thereby stealing it from other men, but we can't steal from the opposite sex, which is why intersexual competition is always a same-sex competition. People are always competing with each other. It's not just that, you know, I'm only competing with other women for mates, because that's
Yeah,
only one very narrow part of intersexual competition. In fact, that's, to me, I think that's actually a little bit of it's a bit of intersexual competition that has been very, very heavily focused on. I don't really think that's where most of the action is. So yes, there is some competition for mates. There is some competition happening at that, you know, early adult stage where people are pairing up and jostling for access to the best partners and trying to outcompete each other for the best partners and things like that. But so much of intersexual competition happens outside of that space and all through the lifespan. And I think that from that perspective, what I actually think that feminism's attack on masculinity is it's not, even though it's looks for all the world like an attack on men, and it certainly has had, you know, tremendous negative outcomes for men, but what it actually is an attack on other women's reproductive choices. So masculine men are high quality men. They're men who usually typically have excellent quality genes. They're going to be very well able to protect you, and even more importantly than that, they're going to be very well able to protect your children. And that's critical. People, I think, underestimate the protective role that fathers play for children.
yeah,
That is, you know, it's yes, it's about providing protection for, like me as a female choosing a male partner that can protect me, that's one thing, but it's much more about protecting the children who are much more vulnerable again even than I am. So one of the things that I find incredibly interesting, but haven't looked into it more than that, but I find incredibly interesting is that coming out of the forensic psychology literature is that when you ask pedophiles and the predators of children in prison what makes you choose which child to attack, the answer is the father. If
Yeah,
the
of
father
course.
is strong, the child is safe. If the father is weak or absent, then the child is in danger.
In danger.
So the importance of fathers to children, strong fathers to children, cannot be overstated, which means that it's again a very effective strategy to try to invert the mate choices of other women to attempt to demonize masculinity and to glorify femininity in men. And that's what feminism has been doing for several decades now, very successfully. And I have no direct evidence that I can point to support this observation, except that the observation again is very intriguing and interesting. It is very interesting that male testosterone levels are actually going down and have
Yeah.
been going down across the last few decades. And I don't think that's unrelated to this whole system either. So what we've got is you've got a population of women who are demonizing masculinity, and in response, a population of men who are dialing down that masculinity at a biological
Yeah.
level. And so what that is doing is inverting female mate preferences, causing women to make less than optimal mate choices, and in fact causing women to even not just make less than optimal, but to actually reject high quality mates who might be interested in them because they've been branded toxic, and they've been uh, sort of taught to dislike and be suspicious of such men. And that's what I think the attack on sort of masculinity, and that's why you've got these male populations that are dropping in testosterone. And then of course another thing that you see, which is also something that is not specific to the here and now, but something that you can see in other civilizations as well, and that is that no, I don't know about the actual levels of testosterone dropping in the past. I don't think we'll ever have those data. But what we do see, though, is men being less willing to fight, less
Yes.
willing to join the armed forces, less willing to defend. So at the same time as you're seeing this increase in females in the institutions, and you're seeing this disruption of meritocracy, inversion of the meritocracy, and you're seeing the societies become weaker, becoming weak on crime increasing, you're actually seeing the men, instead of responding how you might expect men to respond in such a scenario if men had been selected for to withstand this and to prevent this from happening, instead of seeing the men responding to this threat to their society by doubling down on the
Yes.
testosterone, you see the opposite. You see the men of the civilization dialing down their testosterone, dialing down their masculinity, dialing down their propensity for violence, to the point where you now frequently see things, and this is anecdote, so it shouldn't be taken overly seriously, but much more commonly you can now see men behaving, or anyone really, not always men, but certainly often men behaving erratically and dangerously in public, and no one does anything. There
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
a point in time where a man could not harass a woman in public without five other men spontaneously surrounding him and telling him where to get off. Now everyone just looks in the other direction.
Well, it has
Um,
always been like that, and it is still the case in many, many countries, but less and less in the West. But Eastern
that's
Europe,
right.
for example, or Middle East, countries that regions that I know very well, you do not harass a woman in the street. You will be beaten
That's right.
by other men for sure.
Yeah. And
And
that's what used to happen in the West as well.
of course,
When I grew up, there is no way that a
yeah.
man would have got away with doing anything like that without getting the crap beat out of
But
him. These
I'll tell you,
days people look the other way.
if this would happen to me I don't live in the cities anymore. I live in the mountains. But if I was in the city and I would see a woman fight with a guy, I'm not sure I would join and break it up anymore. Even if I do have the means, I do have the capacity to do it. I'm trained in martial arts, and I've permit to carry a gun and all that. Um,
Because there would be
you know,
consequences for you.
that, but also maybe she did something. You know, that's the and I agree. In the
The other
past,
thing.
that would never have crossed the mind of any man. Another data point that could be of
Mm,
interest for you is that, contrary to what we said before about the high classes, the upper levels of society who basically, when they're very wealthy, they try not to have too many children unless they're religious fundamentalists and so on. Um, However, one big difference is that all the time, everywhere in the world, the higher level of classes are the ones who wanted to fight the men. The men was the one who want to prove that they were worthy of being in that high level society to fight the most, whether it was British Empire, whether it was, even the French with these silk pants and effeminated rig, what's the name, wigs
yeah,
and so
yeah,
on. They were fighters. They were not effeminate in the behavior. They looked
yeah.
a bit weird, but they were not weird. And they were very masculine and fighting, and they were looking for honor and fighting. And I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Jack Donovan on the four virtues of masculinity, which are honor, skill, okay, I will. It will come back, but that is an interesting data point. Is that we are the first society where not only where we don't fight, and the other data point you mentioned, testosterone levels.
Mm,
We have studied that when you're a supporter of a sports team, when your team wins, your testosterone levels increase, and when your sport team loses, they decrease. And we're in a society where we are put on the shame, even if
yes.
many people like me don't care. I mean, I'm unshameable, but they try to shame you on what your ancestors did or whatever, and when it works, you feel like you're losing. It feels your team is being chastised, is being lost. And because you never win, because every time you vote for a political policy, you're losing, because the vast majority of the women and the boomer generation vote against you anyway. So you lose all the time. No wonder so that's an interesting data point to add to what you said. Just
I, I
I,
think so. And then I think the other thing that happens then, and this is also something that we see in other civilizations as well, where they talk about the capital cities start to look like they could be anywhere in the world. So
Mhm.
as civilizations begin to weaken, you go to the capital cities and you don't even know where in the world you could be because of how much immigration there is. So the other thing that we see that appears again, to be a common theme is these porous borders and the sort of continual invitation in of all these migrants, which, as you say, are very much more commonly men than they are women and children, which is not just the case now, but it's always been the case. The migrants were
Of course.
merchant businessmen, sailors, whatnot, right?
I
Always,
think of
always.
Australia. Australia is the
Now,
poster child for that.
yeah, well, exactly. And look, and that's entirely consistent with Gad Sad's argument that it's about women sort of, effectively just, creating competition for men, just bringing in more men to increase competition for men. There's a few reasons why I don't think that's that's that likely. So the first thing is that the rest of female behavior at this point in time is not overly concerned with men. So most of female
Mhm.
behavior is focused on not having children, not being married, having careers, and all that sort of
True.
thing. That's what it's targeted at. So much so that I think what even though the sex ratio looks more or less even in terms, if you count the number of people in the population, the number of women that are actually available in the dating pool, or not just in the dating pool, because some of them do date and get married but just don't have children. So the availability of women in the reproductive pool is actually very low. So I think women actually already have quite a skewed sex ratio because so many of them are actually not
So
available. And so I'm not sure that there necessarily is that pressure to bring in more men for competitive reasons. However, what there would potentially be very strong selection pressure for these sort of porous open borders is to bring in more men who are far more aggressive and dangerous than the society's current men. So if you're going to bring in a bottleneck, if the whole point of this is to induce this bottleneck amongst the local population, and you then want the population to explode again, it's not going to explode with the highly effeminate, low testosterone men that you have been spent the last several decades producing and curating, right?
Hmm.
And it's also not going to explode with anybody who is in a pattern of behavior of a civilization in decline. So you would need, if you want the population to explode again, you need to bring in the kinds of people who are from a civilization that is in a very, very different state, a civilization where the men are aggressive, where they fight, where they go to war, where they want to build things, a civilization that is at that part of the curve. That is where you want to bring the men from. And so that is why we see this influx of men from the Middle East and Africa preferentially
Yeah.
into European countries at this particular point in time. And not just that we see them preferentially, because other people would obviously try to come as well, but we see
Yeah, yeah. It's what we
the
see
support.
in
And
the
so it's
role.
what, yeah, it's what Gadsad calls suicidal empathy. So he sort of has
Mhm.
this idea,
Good
I
point.
shouldn't put words in his mouth, because he also is writing a book, and effectively writing it in real time on Twitter, telling everyone where
Yes.
he's up. Um,
Yeah.
but so I don't want to kind of preempt exactly what he's going to say about suicidal empathy, but from what I think anyone can tell, his basic stick is that you've got these empathetic responses that are being
Yes.
misdirected, right? And people, and my argument is that it's not empathetic responses, and they're not being misdirected. This is not them malfunctioning. This is actually feminism working as intended. This is
Yeah.
actually end stage civilization working exactly as intended.
Yeah.
It's not a
Yeah.
malfunction, and I don't think it's especially driven by empathy either. I'm not really as on board with the notion of suicidal empathy as a lot of other
No,
people.
because in fact, no one likes them in Europe. I mean, no one likes the immigrants in Europe. I mean, no one. And because, first of all, because of average IQ, which is what
Yep,
it is. I'm not
yep,
going to comment further,
yep, yep.
but also because women feel threatened by these men as well. So I don't buy the empathy thing because first, and by the way, when the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire collapsed, it was not people from Africa and the Middle East who came. It was people from the north, my ancestors. It was people from from
Yes,
from Sweden and Germany, or today's Germany, and they were what they were different than in culture than Rome, and they adapted. In fact, they genetically mixed with whoever was left in Rome, and so it is not necessary. But I think your point is right. It is the empathy goes only one way in the sense that we are not. First of all, we have not been very empathic as Europeans until a few decades ago. To be actually truthful, we're not exactly
yep,
the kindest and yeah,
yep,
we abolished slavery. We went around to bring civilization. Yeah, but we plundered and pillaged as well. So like everyone does. By the way, I don't feel ashamed about it at all. But it wasn't me. I wasn't there. But today, yes, there is a little bit of empathy, a little bit of compassion, and all that because we were so wealthy, we could share a lot of the wealth, but we're not wealthy anymore at all. At least in Europe, where we're in a fast crash, and probably in America
as
as well.
as in Australia, as in the UK, as in Canada, and America too, probably.
So once
The
the fridges are empty, and that's the theory of my books, we are going to turn, whether you like it or not, whether people like it or not, we're going to turn into extreme violence, and the testosterone levels will rise in matter of weeks very
intensity.
high because that's the way humans behave. It's
Yep.
unfortunate perhaps, but that's the way it is. I certainly don't rejoice about it. But so my perhaps to shift gears to the end of this conversation, which I thoroughly enjoy, and I hope the you who are watching enjoy as well. Um, how do we turn it back? Because historically, I don't know many empires who managed to turn around a path of collapse. There are some revivals. It did happen. China is an interesting exception, but Egypt is gone. Babylon and Persia is gone. The Arab Empire, whatever, which it's never coming back. Rome is gone. Well, some people say Rome is in is now in Russia, but I don't believe that. But how do we turn back this trend?
So, look, there's I think the sensible answer is that we don't. I think the sensible and realistic answer is that we don't. I don't, it's tempting for every civilization to think that they're special and unique. And obviously we have tremendous technology that hasn't had before. But I think it's quite naive, I think, and you see it a lot with, policies that they have to try to cure the drug problems or to try to stop crime, these sort of, weird and wonderful ideas, and they almost always they don't work. And the reason they don't work is they rely on a sort of fundamental change in human behavior, which you simply cannot do, right? You cannot change the basic fundamental nature of being human. And so I don't think that there is going to be, I don't know how easy it would be, if at all possible, to stop any civilization from eventually running into the ground, let alone one that is already well on its way,
Yeah.
which is what we are. We are well on its way. So I said to I said to a guy I was talking to a few weeks ago that, like, when you're the football coach, you want, you want all the blokes on the team to believe that you can win, right? If there's anybody on the team who doesn't actually think you can win, you're not going to win, right? He's not going to play. He's not going to play to win because he doesn't actually believe he can. And if you have a whole team who think that you can't win, then you're not going to win. And based on that, you probably don't want me in the room when you're having conversations about how to stop this, because I really don't think that you can. I don't think. I think that, I think that, like you, we're very likely headed for probably, what will, I'm sure it will be called World War III at some point, but it will be a series of civil wars, I suspect.
Yeah.
That will probably, once one breaks out, I suspect the rest will not be too far behind. And then it will be, it'll be every man for himself, if you like, I think. And, the chips will fall where they may, and we will see what rises from that. That is what I think is probably the most likely outcome.
Which is in fact a good outcome for women because they pick the winners.
Well, it's a good outcome for those.
Or
Well,
not.
it's a good
It's a
outcome
challenging.
genetically.
It's a it's a challenging question. It's not an
Yeah,
affirmation.
look, it's a good outcome genetically. I'm not sure that what is going to rise from the ashes of the West, assuming that the West loses, which it may not. I mean, that I think is
Not.
perhaps the most optimistic. I think maybe is the most optimistic possibility, is that there will be violent clashes, but the side that nominally represents the West in various places will actually win rather than lose. That is probably the most optimistic, realistic outcome that we can hope for, because the alternative would not be good.
By the way, as a side note, what I personally think is going to happen is that the West is not going to win as a culture. However, genetically, and we should define winning as maintaining a territory where you can develop yourself. I don't say this with any ideology. I'm not political at all, but I just say biologically, um, people segregate themselves when there are big crises. We don't, there's a level of crisis where you stick together. Beyond that level, you group with people who look like you, like in a jail. You know,
Yeah,
the people who have one characteristic look stick
Good
together,
form
and they
of
will carve
alliance.
a perimeter and a territory. And in that way, I'm optimistic in the sense that in we will rebuild our territories, however big they will be, I don't know, but and however long that process takes. For sure, we will need one generation to restart the structure of the testosterone, for sure. But then technology makes plays a big game, and this is all assuming we don't have AI and Terminators getting rid of us. But
Well,
it,
that's right. That's that whole. There's a whole extra existential threat just like looming over your back shoulder, isn't there?
yes, but that you cannot plan for what you cannot know or understand. So, but and again, it's not a plan; it's just a conjecture. So I'm sorry if I interrupted you, but I just want to say that I'm actually quite optimistic in a dark way, but it's not something I wish for. But I have to constate what's in English. I just see it the way it
Yeah,
is,
yeah,
unfortunately.
yeah. And I mean, look, and I'm much the same. I don't typically have a very optimistic answer. The other kind of sort of less pragmatic answer and more theoretical answer that I could give is that if we want to change, if we want to change anyone's behavior, there's, it's fairly straightforward. You identify the cues that produce certain behaviors and you change those cues. That's how you change behavior. Behavior is a response to a particular situation. So you change the situation, you change the circumstance, and that will change the cues. Um, I think the problem with that is that the changes we would have to make to the circumstances to produce fundamentally different behavior at this point in time, theoretically that would potentially work, but again, logistically, I don't. How do you get a whole generation of women out of the workplace and civic duty and back into the home and the family and having children? That's
Well,
not, I don't,
there's two
not, I
ways.
don't think going to be an easy thing. That's not
There
going
is
to be
two
an easy
ways.
thing.
One that doesn't work because a lot of people are scared of Islam. Islam is not successful in doing this. It was in the old days, but today,
Not in,
in all Muslim countries, the women take over, and it's exactly the same pattern as in the West. The
yeah,
Western system of advertising feminism is way stronger than Islam. Of course, you have fundamentalism, but the same in Israel. I work a lot in Israel. You have in Jerusalem, you have an area of the city where you have all religious fundamentalists. They have, or they try now because it's more hard. Something happened in the last few years. I don't know why. They
yeah.
try to have 5, 7, 10 children, but
But the rest of Israel is not
no,
especially high.
no,
That's right. It's
no,
it's
they don't
that
have a
small
lot of
group
children
that's
anymore.
disproportionately responsible for Israel's high birth rate. It's not a population-wide effect.
No.
No.
So certainly that's one way that doesn't go. So I say people, if you're scared of Islam, don't be, because of course it's a very masculine and very patriarchal culture, but it's disappearing in reality. You have people from the Middle East and Africa, a lot more everywhere, but that culture is disappearing just as the West is disappearing. I have no threat, I think, for that. And I forgot the second way. Oh yeah, the second way is when you have no more work. You say what would make women stop working? Well, when will be no work at all for anyone, and you have to come back to producing food, building stuff, and
Yeah.
there you need that, and that's the theory of my book. In fact, that we have the need of men and women working together, because if we want to have families, children, and producing survival, food and medicine and whatever, you need to work hard and forget glorified secretary work, PR assistants, and all that. This is gone,
Adult care
and in the
jobs.
world we're going, this is happening very fast. So
Well, that's that. I mean, look, that is true. If you got rid of the knowledge work jobs, then you would also get rid of a lot of women out of the workplace because the physical labor jobs are nowhere near as appealing, in spite of feminists' best efforts to get
yeah,
women
not many in construction
into
work.
those industries. That's right.
No,
It's
but I must say to my audience again, they know me. Um, I'm a big lover of. I'm trying to find the right words in English. Otherwise, I have a Me Too thing. of the collaboration between men and women, and that we are super needed, including in the workplace, because a lot of women are very smart, of course, and they're very much able. You know, you're a PhD in psychology. I mean, the brain of all the population is valuable and it's very needed. I'm just saying often that maybe one way is to first have kids and then have your PhD rather than spending the best years doing PhD, because the best years are the youngest years for women because there's more fertility. And then you have plenty of time to do all the intellectual research in the world and you can have kids. Because as we know, the kids take the most time from conception to year 5 to 7.
Yeah.
Then it's easy. It's super
Yeah.
easy. I mean, comparable. Not like they're
Yeah.
1 to 2,
Easy.
2 years old. It's terrible. And but yeah, that I've had four, so I can remember. And teenager years, but teenage years you cannot do much. It's tough, but you
No,
can
you
manage it.
just stress and worry, but you can't do
Yes,
anything.
and you pay a lot. But that's see. So, but perhaps to finish, you know, as we want to, my fiance is here, is listening to our conversation. Would you have a question, Professor Sulikowski? She's not ready for the question. See, I like to play tricks. Any question on the role of women and men in society? And you have to speak loud because microphone is here. Come behind me to push the question. You choose. Okay, she needs to think. She wants to look good. I got her by treason. So perhaps to conclude, before we get the question from Olga, what is your where people can find your work? Where can they look at what you do? And I will put this
So
on the description of the
yeah,
video.
so follow me on X at Dr Dani S. That's where I say most of the more interesting things that I say. I also have a Substack, and so a big shout out to all the people who have subscribed to my Substack, even though it's been an eternity since I've posted something new on there. But I am actually going to commit to all those people as a if as a thank you, if nothing else, to all those people. I will actually start writing on there much more frequently. So those people who've already subscribed have got something to look forward to. But if you follow me on X, that will lead to anything else interesting I might do or say on other platforms in other places. So
A question? There is a question. No, no question. So I'll have a final question.
okay.
We have daughters. People in this room have daughters. What shall we tell them as they grow up?
Oh, so I have a daughter as well. So I also have thought about what to tell my daughter about a lot of things. And the main thing, I'm not sure if this is a good thing or a bad thing or not. The main thing I've started telling her is to try and instill in her a sense of confidence and a sense of just invincibility. You know, as she's only 5 years old. As she gets, you know, older, I'll start to teach her about having to be cautious and look after herself. But for the moment, you know, I just want her to be fearless, because I think that the world is going to be a very challenging place, and it's not going to be a very enjoyable place for people who are scared of challenges. So I think I just want her to be fearless, and as she gets a bit older, maybe sensible, but fearless.
My last books, not on, these ones are not translated in English yet. It's about how you manage fear. So indeed,
Ah,
fearlessness for girls, interesting. I always say that fear should be your friend. So you need to recognize it, manage it, and use it. But certainly, you need to be strong in the world. For that's what I say my daughters as well. To be strong because, and I tell them to find a strong man if they can.
yes, yes.
But I have older
Always
daughters than you.
advice.
They're 15 to 19 here. So anyway, thank you very much, Professor. I will send you the link of the video, of course. And for those who listen to us, the description of where you can find all the information is going to be here below in the description of the video. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. I've had a great time.
Thank you.